afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities or are of community importance, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners get a better understanding of the project and provide input along the way. I'm flying solo today, so this episode might be a little shorter than normal, but let's get started. Today's topic is preliminary findings of the surface water studies, and we think it's important to discuss these topics and share that discussion with our viewers and listeners. So let's get started with an overview of the topics we're going to talk about today, and then we're going to get into a bit of. So we're going to start off by providing some project background, which we always do, because some of our listeners and viewers are new and aren't familiar with the project. So we try to get everybody up to the same level of background knowledge on the project. So we'll do that, and then we'll talk about the surface water studies. After that, their purpose, the purpose of these studies, and then get into the preliminary results of these field studies. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can keep in touch and get in touch with us as well. So lots to cover today. So let's move into the project location just to familiarize everyone as to where we are talking about here. So Webequie First Nation is about 200 to 250 kilometers from both James Bay and Hudson Bay. And community's population is about 1,000 members on reserve. And the actual road extends from the airport in Webequie southeast to the McFalls Lake area, which is right in the heart of what's considered to be the Ring of Fire mineral zone. So that's where the project is generally located. Let's talk a little bit now about the purpose of the project itself. The first purpose is to move materials, supplies, and materials from the airport to the McFalls Lake area in the Ring of Fire. The second is to provide employment and economic development opportunities to Webequie members while allowing them to preserve their language and culture and continue to live in their community. And then finally, to provide experience and training opportunities for youth to encourage them to get additional skills through post-secondary education. In terms of the project itself, it's a planned 107 kilometer long road, 2-lane gravel road, again extending from the airport in Webequie southeast to east of the Bukatai River in the McFalls Lake area. 17 of those 107 kilometers sit on the actual First Nation Reserve lands. The planning corridor that is being used for the project, so the preferred corridor that was identified from a number of alternatives, is 2 kilometers wide. So the actual road will sit somewhere within that 2 kilometer wide band that extends from Webequie Airport to the McFalls Lake area. And then the actual corridor width will be 35 meters to accommodate that's the right-of-way width, and that will accommodate the 2-lane gravel surface road. And then in terms of other details about the project, there will be 3 major water body crossings. The first being, as we move out of Webequie, being of Winisk Lake, which is about 200 to 250 meters in width. The second is Winiskis Channel, south of there, to the southeast of the settled area in Webequie. And that's about 30 to 40 meters in width. And then the final major crossing is that of the Mukatai River, again 30 to 40 meters in width, and that's just before the eastern end of the road. As I always say, all season road projects don't just consist of a 2-lane road. They include other what we call ancillary infrastructure, other infrastructure. Some is temporary, some is permanent, and so temporary facilities, well, both temporary and permanent facilities could include pits and rock quarries where the construction material is obtained to build the road. There are also other facilities such as construction camps, which would be temporary, as they're there to accommodate crews while the road is being built. And then there are permanent operations and maintenance offices that would be constructed as part of the project. And again, those facilities have to have the supportive infrastructure, such as a small wastewater treatment plant and a potable water or drinking water storage tanks as well. And then finally, typically associated with the camps are storage and laydown yards. For these would be temporary and they're during the construction period and therefore the storage of equipment and materials. So let's dive into the surface water studies and talk about these. We'll lead off with a discussion on the purpose of these studies. So what we're trying to do here, like we are with other disciplines, is to establish a baseline. So to understand the way conditions are currently. And then from that, we're trying to identify potential effects on surface water resources as a result of the project. So that's really what we're trying to do. Develop that baseline so we know the way things are now, and then try to predict possible effects of the project. And then those effects that are identified, we try to provide recommendations for minimizing the negative impacts, whether they be environmental, health, social, economic, related to water, surface water, during the construction and operation and maintenance of the project. So in terms of what was studied, we looked at you, we looked at two things. We looked at surface water quantity and we look at surface water quality. So when we talk about quantity, what we're trying to do is look at changes in stream flows and in water levels and in erosion and sedimentation, which can change with water levels and with stream flows. Um, Particularly at the crossings, because of course the road has a number of water crossings, three major ones as we talked about before, but there are a number of them in total. And so what we're trying to do is really focus in on the areas where the road crosses these water courses and then get a better understanding of the way things are now. And then given the nature of the project, the way the project is, like the characteristics of the project, try to predict what might happen. So in the course of our work, we're going to determine the number of and type of water body crossings, the magnitude of changes to stream flow as a result of the project, any changes in water levels that might occur from the project, um, any changes in runoff rates, the rates at which the water runs off over the landscape, and how much of a catchment area. And so a catchment area is, I guess, the best way to describe it is a drainage area to a certain point, is disturbed by the physical activity associated with building the actual roads. And then finally, we're trying to understand and get it and describe any changes in general to drainage patterns, to land cover. So how would like if we identified that water levels were going to rise significantly and areas would be flooded that weren't previously flooded, what impact would that have on land cover? So things like vegetation. Um, and with those higher water levels, there could be potential erosion and sedimentation, which has other downstream impacts by reducing the visibility in the water and changing the aquatic habitat as well. So, um, in terms of surface water quantity, those are the kinds of things that we looked at. Let's talk now about surface water quality. And so when we talk about surface water quality, we're talking about looking at changes, potential changes to the biological or chemical properties of surface water in the project area. And the question is, how do we do that? Well, we look at possible increases in the concentration of what's called suspended solids, or we also look at chemical constituents. So any changes in the chemistry of the water as a result of the project. So let's start with suspended solids. So if you imagine that if water levels were to rise um, at at a particular water crossing, and there might be upstream higher water levels, then you might get more erosion and sedimentation, which would be, so erosion is soil loss, right? So let's say more soil was lost into the river or stream, that would increase the concentration of suspended solids, of solids in the water column. So when you take a sample, there's more solids floating in that sample than in the same size sample than previously before the project. So that can have an impact on aquatic impact or on aquatic habitat. So that's something that's definitely considered. We also look at chemistry of the water before the project, and we try to identify how the chemistry might be changed as a result of the project. Obviously, we don't want the chemistry to change significantly, and so we take actions to ensure that this is minimized as much as possible, just as we would with suspended solids. So if we're doing work installing a bridge at a water crossing, we would use all the different mitigation methods like silt fences and things like that to prevent soil loss into the water course, into the stream or river. Um, okay, let's move now to talk about some of the preliminary results of these surveys. Uh, and again, there's been a lot of work done on surface water for this project. Two different branches of work. There's the sort of quantity side where we're looking at impacts on the amount of water as a result of the project, and then the quality side. So let's start with the quantity side. So in the course of doing our work, and once the preferred corridor was identified, we identified a total of 26 water crossings, 3 of which were major. So then we dove in a little bit more deeply for each of these crossings and tried to understand these a little bit better. So we went through and profiled each one of these crossings, as you'll see on the next slide. So the next slide, you're seeing a picture of the crossing location itself, and then you're seeing a map with a sort of a pink area on there, and that area actually shows the drainage to the point of the crossing. So that's the area that drains to that point. So if you imagine a river's flowing in a particular direction, and let's say there's a water crossing uh, upstream of there, the computer goes through and identifies um, all the water, the land area that's drained to that particular point, land and water area that drains to a particular point. So that's what these two examples are showing us on the screen. And it may be hard to see clearly what the words are on these slides, but I'll give you a bit of an idea. So the kind of information that's on this slide for each catchment associated with a water crossing is the drainage area, um, Things like the length of the main channel through this area, things like the elevation, the minimum and maximum channel elevations. So understanding, the height of the land, like at the base of the channel, what's the lowest elevation? So that's sort of the height as it sits on the earth. So we look at the maximum and minimum channel elevations. We look at the area of lakes and wetlands within that drainage area. We look at the average elevation. We look at the highest elevation and the lowest elevation in that area. And then we look at what you call slope. Slope is sort of a rate of change of elevation. So we do a pretty detailed deep dive into these areas, these where these crossing locations are, because we need to understand what we're trying to understand is impacts of the project. So does this affect um, water flow, and in what way? Will it cause water levels to increase? And then what can be done to limit or mitigate those impacts? Um, let's now talk about, if we move to the next slide, some of the other things that we talk about. So the physical characteristics of water crossings. So you may be able to see these on your screen, but some of the headings on here are things like the type of water body, um, the flow rate. So for example, how the volume of water that's moves across a certain point per second. And then we get into things like, and these are measured in the field where possible, mean wetted depth and bank full width. And what these are different measures. They're measures of the water course, so we can get an understanding of the physical characteristics of where these crossings are going. Understand the water levels relative to the existing surface of the water. So we identify the high water mark based on the surface, and then we identify the high water mark based on the bottom of the channel, like the floor of the river, as they call it. And then we collect other information like the substrate type. So you may be asking, what is substrate? Substrate is the bottom of the watercourse, the type of material at the bottom. Is it small stones? Is it clay or silt? Is it you know is it um, rocks, larger rocks? What is the bottom type? So that's what we mean by substrate, which helps make up aquatic environment. And then we make notes on things like whether beaver dams were seen as well. So we need to collect all that information because we need that information to populate models. So the hydrologists, hydrology engineers who study the surface water, they have to evaluate each of the crossings and identify. Um, uh, they have to identify what the flows will be under certain conditions, and that is extremely helpful in identifying, from an engineering point of view, what type of structure is required, whether and what size of structure. So the span or the length that's being crossed tends to decide whether it's a bridge or a culvert. But with culverts, there's different types of culverts. There's different openings for culverts. So having this other information and doing this modeling helps us to identify what would be required at each of these crossings. So um, that's really important work to understand the physical characteristics at the water crossings. On the water quality side, if we move to the next slide, I just thought I'd give you an idea of the kind of information that we collect. So when our team is out in the field conducting their fisheries work, we're taking water quality samples. And what you see on the screen now is a sample which indicates just typically how things are reported. So on the left-hand side, you have what you call field parameters. So you've got measurements that are taken in the field by the field team, and then you have, in this particular example, you see general chemistry, and then you have different parameters underneath there. So, parameters, the best way to describe them is different chemicals that are tested for. And for many of the chemicals, there are standards or guidelines that are typical. So there's what you call the provincial water quality objectives. These are used to be able to identify whether you've got, maybe some results for a particular chemical that might exceed normal, and it might indicate that maybe um, there are elevated values of a certain chemical there, concentrations of a certain chemical there. So they're used as something to compare our results to. And then I think along the top of the table here, you can also see things like WB-1, WC-2. So what those are is those are the crossing numbers. So for each crossing where a sample was taken, it indicates the sample that was taken, or the date it was taken, and then as you go down, you see the results, the lab results for each of the chemical parameters that was sampled. So that's what that basically means when you see a table like that. So as we get close to wrapping up here, let's talk now about the results that we got. So there wasn't anything particularly surprising results-wise from our work. So generally, there were very few exceedances of these guidelines I was talking about, the Canadian Environmental Quality Guidelines, the Water Quality Guidelines for the Protection of Aquatic Life and Freshwater, or the Provincial Water Quality Objective. So this didn't happen very often. And there were exceedances of field pH, so pH that was sampled in the field. There were exceedances of those. There were exceedances for aluminum. There were exceedances for iron as well in all three of our events in 2019, 2020, and 2021. However, since these exceedances occurred in areas that really haven't had any development whatsoever, um, these exceedances are likely naturally occurring, or from an distant upstream source. And I think comparisons with previous samples taken in the area indicates that, they're part of sort of a naturally occurring elevated levels of the different parameters in those particular areas. So there was nothing that indicated, any area was, there were no, I guess, alarms that were set off, I think, based on our water quality sampling. So, which is great news, which is really good news. So that just about wraps up today's live stream. We hope this was helpful. We hope you understood it, and if you didn't, please, send us a message, and we can try and help explain things to you more if you like. We're happy to spend as much time as needed to make sure that you can understand what we're presenting. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, supplyroad.ca. Miigwech, and we will talk to you again next week.